I never imagined I would become someone who measured time by legal deadlines instead of sunsets. Before all of this, I lived quietly. I kept my head down, paid my bills, and believed that if you respected boundaries, others would do the same. Conflict was something that happened to louder people. Two people who went looking for it. I didn't go looking for anything. I just came back to the lake. The property had been in my family longer than I'd been alive, but it never felt like mine until the day I stood at the edge of the water alone. The house was old, built before style mattered, solid wood, wide windows, a dock that creaked when you walked on it. It's the kind of sound that told you it had been there a long time and wasn't planning on leaving. My uncle had lived here by himself for years. He was a quiet man, private to the point of secrecy. We spoke on holidays. Sometimes not even then. When he passed, the house came to me with very little explanation and no instructions. At first, I thought it was just an inheritance. I didn't yet understand it was a warning. The lake looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood. Still, clear. The kind of water that reflects everything without judgment. Standing there that first evening, I felt something loosen in my chest that I didn't realize had been tight for years. For the first time in a long while, I slept without waking up anxious. That peace lasted 10 days. The envelope was waiting in the mailbox when I came back from town. White, thick paper. My name printed neatly in the center, like it belonged on official stationery. The logo in the corner meant nothing to me at the time. HOA. I tossed it on the kitchen counter and didn't open it until night. The house had that familiar creak and settle as the temperature dropped. Outside, the lake went dark, smooth as glass. Inside the envelope were 3 pages. The first page was titled Violation Notice. The second was an assessment summary. The third was a total amount due. I read the number once, then again more slowly. $87,000? I laughed out loud, alone in that quiet house, because it didn't make sense. The list of violations read like something written by someone who had never actually been to the property. Unauthorized shoreline obstruction, improper water access limitation, unapproved waterfront structure, failure to comply with community standards. The dock had been there since before I was born. The house predated the HOA by decades. The shoreline hadn't changed. None of it mattered. The notice said payment was due in 14 days. The next morning, they came in person. 3 of them walked up the path from the road like they already knew where everything was. 2 men and 1 woman. The woman led, clipboard tucked into her arm, her steps confident, practiced. They didn't knock. They rang the bell once and waited. When I opened the door, she smiled and said my name as if we'd met before. "You're in serious violation," she said immediately. I asked which violation. She tilted the clipboard toward me slightly and smiled wider. Multiple. They stepped aside so she could gesture toward the lake behind them. The water shimmered in the sunlight, calm and indifferent. "This lake is a community amenity," she said. "Your dock interferes with established access." I didn't argue. I asked a question instead. "Established by who?" Her smile tightened. "The association." The men behind her shifted their weight. One of them was already flipping through papers, ready to hand them to me. They spoke in rehearsed phrases. Community standards. Shared resources. Known compliance consequences. Everything was framed as if they were doing me a favor by explaining it. When they finally left, I stood on the porch and watched them walk back down the path. Something felt wrong. Not just the fines. Not even the threat. It was the way they moved, like people who had walked that land many times before. That night, I opened the cabinet my uncle had always kept locked. Inside were folders stacked with precision. Old maps, deeds, letters, notes written in the margins of documents that looked official enough to matter. He had been preparing. One survey stood out immediately. It was older than anything I had seen in the HOA packet. The boundary lines were different. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. According to this map, the lake wasn't theirs. I drove to the county records office the next day. The clerk was friendly until I gave her the address. Then her voice dropped, just a little. "You're not the first person to ask about that," she said. She pulled records that took hours to compile. What emerged wasn't confusion or a clerical error. It was replacement. At some point years earlier, an original survey had been quietly superseded by another. The new one extended HOA boundaries to include the lakefront. There was no recorded sale. No transfer. Just new lines drawn over old ones. The signatures didn't match. The dates overlapped incorrectly. I copied everything. Back at the property, I started walking. I followed the shoreline slowly, camera in hand. I photographed pipes hidden behind rocks, intake systems disguised as landscaping features. I traced power lines that ran from the water toward the subdivision uphill. This wasn't casual use. This was infrastructure. They weren't just accessing the lake. They were extracting from it. The second notice arrived 3 days later. The tone was sharper. It accused me of obstruction, claimed I was interfering with community operations, warned of escalating penalties. The third notice mentioned my son. That was when patience stopped being an option. I wrote a letter, 12pages.com, precise, documented. I included copies of original surveys, water rights certificates, a formal request that all records related to lake usage, billing, and infrastructure be preserved. Their response came through an attorney. It was dismissive, condescending, confident. They assumed I would back down. Instead, I hired a forensic accountant. The numbers were worse than I expected. Millions collected through access fees, payments routed through layered entities. No permits. No environmental approvals. No ownership rights. I turned everything over to the state. And then I waited. The HOA escalated. They placed a lien on the property, sent inspectors, tried to block access to the dock. Someone cut power to the boathouse one night and left without a word. Every move added another piece of evidence. Neighbors started showing up quietly, usually after dark. They brought their own notices, their own stories, fines that never made sense, rules that changed without explanation. They had all thought they were alone. They weren't. By the time the investigation went public, the board was already unraveling. Meetings were canceled. Emails stopped. People stopped answering phones. I didn't celebrate. I watched because people who build power on lies always reveal themselves when the pressure changes. The courtroom was full the day the ruling came down. I sat still, hands folded, while the judge read each finding without emotion. Fraud, trespass, unlawful conversion of water resources, invalid enforcement. When she declared the HOA's actions void, the room exhaled as one. Outside, the lake reflected the courthouse windows calm as ever. That evening, I walked back to the dock alone. The water was quiet again. And for the first time since I returned, I felt like the land knew it had been heard. This was only the beginning. But the lie beneath the lake was finally exposed. The first thing power does when it senses resistance is test your isolation. It doesn't come with sirens or shouting. It comes quietly, disguised as procedure, authority, and concern. It tries to find the softest point in your life and press there. Just hard enough to see if you will fold the morning after the second notice. I woke to the sound of a truck idling outside the house. I didn't rush to the window. I already knew who it would be. 2 county inspectors stood near the edge of the driveway, clipboards in hand, boots sinking slightly into the gravel as if they had rehearsed where to stand. Neither of them looked directly at the house at first. They waited. I stepped outside before they rang the bell. One of them introduced himself. The other didn't bother. He was already writing. They said they were responding to a complaint. Environmental concerns. Potential safety hazards? Standard follow-up? I asked who filed the complaint. They said that information wasn't available. I asked what hazards they were investigating. They exchanged a look. Then one of them gestured vaguely toward the lake. Unregulated water structures, he said. I let them inspect everything. The dock, the shoreline, the boathouse. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Still, one of them took photos. A lot of photos. From odd angles, from distances that made context disappear. When they left, neither said goodbye. That afternoon, the lien paperwork arrived. It wasn't subtle anymore. The document stated that failure to resolve outstanding HOA violations could result in foreclosure proceedings. It listed my property value. It listed my name. It listed my son as a dependent occupant. That was deliberate. They weren't just pushing back. They were escalating. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I drove the perimeter of the land again, slower this time. I stopped where the shoreline curved inward and followed a narrow path that cut through brush toward the ridge. The path wasn't old. Branches had been trimmed recently. Stones cleared. Foot traffic heavy at the top of the ridge. I found a fenced enclosure half hidden behind trees. Inside it was equipment. Pumps. Electrical boxes. Flow meters. Someone had gone to great lengths. To make sure none of this was visible from the water, I photographed everything that night. My son asked why I was on the phone so much. I told him the truth. Just not all of it. Some people are upset about the land, I said. Are we going to have to leave? He asked that question, stayed with me long. After he went to bed, the next move came to days. Later, I came home to find a notice taped to the front door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from Child Services. It stated that an anonymous report had been filed requesting a welfare check due to concerns about living conditions and safety. They had crossed a line. 2 caseworkers arrived the following afternoon. They were polite, professional, clearly uncomfortable. They asked questions, looked around, checked his room, opened cabinets, took notes. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Before leaving, one of them lowered her voice. This happens sometimes, she said carefully. When property disputes turn ugly, I nodded after they left. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the wood grain worn, smooth by decades of use. This was no longer just about land. It was about intimidation, and intimidation only works if you're alone. That evening, I sent out messages, not threats, not accusations, questions to neighbors. 2 former board members. 2 people whose names appeared repeatedly in old HOA emails my uncle had saved. I didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I asked if they had ever been fined, if rules had ever changed suddenly, if access to the lake had ever been explained clearly. The responses trickled in at first. Then they came faster. People shared stories they had never told anyone. Fees that doubled without explanation. Easements they were told had always existed. Notices. Threatening legal action for minor issues. 1. Woman admitted she had sold her house years earlier under pressure because she couldn't keep up with escalating assessments. Another. Family said they stopped using the lake entirely because they were afraid of violating something they didn't understand. Fear had done most of the work for them by the end of the week. I had enough statements to see the shape of it. This wasn't enforcement. It was control. I forwarded everything to the investigator. Handling the case, he called me that night. We're widening the scope, he said. There's more here than we thought. The HOA reacted immediately. An emergency meeting was announced. Attendance strongly encouraged. I went. The room was packed. People stood along the walls, uncertain, tense. The board sat at the front like a jury, faces tight, voices clipped. They spoke about unity, about protecting community values, about misinformation. Then they spoke about me. They didn't say my name at first. They didn't have to. They described a non-compliant property owner, someone refusing cooperation, someone threatening the stability of shared resources. When I stood up, the room went quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I asked one question: who owns the lake? The board president smiled. Thinly, the community, he said. I asked for documentation. He said it was on file. I asked where. He said legal counsel had it. I asked why none of it was recorded with the county. That was when the meeting lost control. People started talking at once. Questions flew. Voices rose. The board adjourned early. The next morning, the power to the boathouse was cut again. This time, they didn't bother pretending it was accidental, but something else had changed. People started calling me, not quietly anymore. They wanted to know what I knew. They wanted copies. They wanted answers. And once people stop being afraid of asking questions, power loses its grip fast. 2 weeks later, subpoenas went out. Records requests followed. The HOA tried to comply selectively. Redacted files, missing pages, delays. It didn't matter. The paper trail was already there when the first resignation hit. It wasn't dramatic. A single board member stepped down for personal reasons. Then another. Then the attorney representing the HOA withdrew. That was the moment I knew the pressure had reached the core. One evening, standing at the edge of the dock, watching the lights from the subdivision flicker on across the water, I realized something. They had built everything on the assumption that no one would ever challenge them. Not because they were strong, but because they were used to being obeyed. The lake didn't care. Neither did the truth. And now, neither did the people who had been paying for both. The storm wasn't over, but the silence they depended on was gone. And once silence breaks, power has nowhere left to hide. Power never collapses all at once. It fractures first. The signs are small if you don't know what you're looking for. Missed emails. Meetings that suddenly need rescheduling. Lawyers who stop returning calls. Confidence that turns brittle at the edges. I noticed it the day the gates came down. They didn't announce it. There was no notice posted. One morning, the steel arms that had blocked the main road for years were simply lifted and tied back with yellow straps. Like someone didn't want to draw attention to the fact that control had slipped. People started driving through without stopping. No guards, no checks, just silence. That same afternoon, the state investigator called again. We're moving forward, he said. Civil and criminal. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. His voice carried something different now. Not caution, certainty. The subpoenas hit hard. Bank records, communications, vendor contracts, water usage logs. Decades worth of documents that had never been meant to sit under fluorescent lights in a government office. The HOA tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a boundary dispute, a clerical error that had snowballed. That narrative lasted exactly 1 week, because paperwork doesn't lie, and water leaves a trail. The accountant uncovered billing structures that made no sense unless you assumed intent. Fees labeled as maintenance that were funneled into shell entities. Payments routed through layers designed to obscure ownership. The water itself became evidence. Testing revealed extraction levels far beyond what the lake could naturally replenish. Environmental filings had been bypassed. Impact assessments never conducted. They hadn't just taken land. They had exploited it. When the board president resigned, it was late at night. An email sent at 11:47 p.m. citing health concerns. By morning, It had been forwarded to everyone. People gathered on the shore in small groups, talking openly now, comparing notes. Realizing how much they had paid and for what, anger spread faster than fear ever had. The emergency meeting that followed was chaos. No scripts. No prepared statements. Just residents demanding answers from a board that no longer had any. I didn't speak at first. I listened. A man stood up and asked why his assessments had tripled in 5 years. A woman asked why access rules changed depending on who you were. Someone else asked who actually owned the pumps by the North Ridge. No one answered. When I finally stood, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't accuse, I explained. I showed them the original surveys, the recorded boundaries, the water rights documentation that predated every house on that hillside. I explained how the extraction system worked, where the money went, why the fees never added up. The room didn't erupt. It went quiet. People don't like being shouted at. They don't like being threatened. But they hate being fooled. The lawsuit landed 2 weeks later. Not from me. From the residents, class action, fraud, misrepresentation, unlawful enrichment. The HOA dissolved itself within days. That didn't stop the investigation. It accelerated it. Federal involvement followed quickly once interstate financial routing became clear. The quiet confidence that had once surrounded the board evaporated completely. Assets were frozen. Accounts locked. Properties seized pending review. The people who had once sent inspectors and notices stopped appearing altogether. I saw one of them once, weeks later, loading boxes into the trunk of his car. He avoided eye contact. The courtroom was full when the civil ruling came down. Not just lawyers and officials. Families, retirees, people who had spent years believing they were at fault for rules that never made sense. The judge spoke plainly. She acknowledged the residents as victims. She voided the enforcement actions. She ordered restitution. She recognized the original ownership and restored the boundaries to where they had always been. The lake was never theirs. It never had been. The criminal cases took longer. They always do. But the outcomes were inevitable. Fines, sentences, disbarments, quiet plea deals that never made headlines. The machine that had fed on compliance collapsed under scrutiny. Months later, I stood at the edge of the dock again. The illegal pumps were gone. The shoreline cleared. The water moved differently now, cleaner, freer. The gates never went back up. The road stayed open. People fished again without checking rule books. Kids swam without wondering if they were breaking something invisible. The lake belonged to the land again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the surface turned copper, my son sat beside me. "So," he said, skipping a stone across the water, "are we done?" I thought about it. About my uncle. About the cabinet. About the way silence had protected wrongdoing for years. "We're done fighting," I said. But not paying attention, he nodded like that made sense. Power doesn't disappear when you expose it. It just loses its shadows. And once people see clearly, it never works the same way again. The lake didn't change, but everything around it did, and that was enough.